In the final years of the 19th century, the biting winds of Michigan were carrying more than just the scent of winter. They were carrying the sound of a dying industry. In a small town called Plymouth, a group of desperate men sat inside the iron windmill company, watching their bank accounts drain as fast as the water they were trying to pump. They were in the business of survival. They built massive, clunky structures designed to harness the sky, but the market was shifting and the farmers were looking elsewhere. They were engineers of the soil, not the soul. Therefore, they needed a gimmick so powerful it would force a man to buy a windmill he didn't even know he needed. In 1888, they decided to offer a free gift with every purchase. It was a crude, spindly device made of a metal pipe and a spring-loaded piston. It was an air rifle. The executives viewed it as a toy, a cheap trinket to be tossed into the back of a wagon, but when the first customer pulled the trigger, he didn't look at the windmill. He looked at the gun and remarked that it was a Daisy. That one sentence was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually turn a failing machinery plant into a manufacturer of childhood ballistics. The company realized almost immediately that the people of America were far more interested in shooting things than they were in pumping water. Therefore, they abandoned the windmills entirely and rebranded themselves as the Daisy Manufacturing Company. They had stumbled into a gold mine, but the gold was shaped like a weapon. As they began to mass-produce these early air rifles, they weren't just selling steel and wood. They were selling a specific, dangerous brand of American freedom. But as the decades passed and the toys became more sophisticated, the line between a harmless distraction and a lethal tool began to blur in ways the public wasn't prepared for. By the time the middle of the 20th century approached, the company knew they needed more than just a functional product. They needed a legend. They needed a way to make their air rifles feel like a requirement for every boy in the country. In 1938, they struck a deal that would change the landscape of the American home forever. They partnered with a comic strip hero named Red Ryder. He was a red-headed cowboy who represented justice, grit, and the law of the frontier. By putting his name on a lever-action carbine, Daisy wasn't just selling a BB gun anymore. They were selling the idea of manhood itself. They were telling every child in the country that they weren't a real American if they didn't have a Red Ryder in their hands. This was a psychological masterstroke, but it was also a dangerous game. They were taking a product that could travel at speeds high enough to penetrate skin and bone and wrapping it in the innocent imagery of a comic book. The Red Ryder was designed to look exactly like the Winchester rifles used by the heroes of the West. It had the wood stock, the leather wrap, and the iconic lever action. But beneath the nostalgia, the engineering was designed for maximum output. The rifle could hold over 600 rounds of ammunition. This meant a child could walk into the woods and fire for hours without ever having to stop and think about what they were doing. The company marketed this as a feature of endless fun, but in reality, it was a recipe for tragedy. They had created a high-capacity weapon for the most impulsive demographic on the planet. They knew that children were not known for their trigger discipline, yet they prioritized the infinite fun of the 600-shot reservoir over the safety of the neighborhood. Therefore, the product became a cultural phenomenon. But the hidden cost was already mounting in the form of emergency room visits and permanent injuries that the company worked tirelessly to keep out of the headlines. The success of the 1938 launch was unlike anything the toy industry had ever seen. The Red Ryder became the top-selling air rifle in the world almost overnight. It was the gift that defined every Christmas and every birthday. But as the money poured into Plymouth, the company began to lean into a dark form of marketing. They started telling parents that the BB gun was a tool for character building. They suggested that if a father didn't buy his son a Red Ryder, he was failing to prepare him for the harsh realities of the world. They used the fear of a soft generation to sell a ballistic tool. They were essentially weaponizing the American father's ego to move units. They created an environment where the danger of the product was ignored because the social cost of not owning one was too high. The Red Ryder had become more than a gun. It was a ghost that haunted the hallways of every suburban home, a symbol of a frontier that was long gone, but a danger that was very, very present. As the middle of the 20th century progressed, the Daisy Manufacturing Company realized they had achieved the ultimate corporate dream. They were no longer just selling a product, they were selling a ritual. The Red Ryder had successfully transitioned from a specialized tool for rural farm boys into a suburban necessity. Therefore, the company moved to solidify this status by creating an elaborate world of accessories and clubs that made the consumer feel like they were part of an elite frontier guard. But beneath the shiny wood finish and the leather thongs lay a cold, calculated effort to ignore the physical reality of the carbine. The engineering was intentionally kept simple to maximize profit, which meant that the consistency of the shot was often unpredictable. To the executives, a slight deviation in the flight of a lead ball was a minor technicality. To a child aiming at a target in a crowded neighborhood, it was a variable that could lead to catastrophe. The marketing department began to push the concept of the Daisy Trail, a series of marksmanship challenges designed to keep children buying more ammunition and more specialized targets. They were building a feedback loop of consumption, but they were also building a culture of risk that had no safety net. The advertisements of this era were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They often featured a father standing over his son, coaching him on how to hold the rifle, creating an image of safe, supervised instruction. However, the company knew that the vast majority of these rifles were being used by children who were completely unsupervised. They were selling the image of the responsible father to the parents, while simultaneously selling the image of the outlaw cowboy to the children. They were playing both sides of the generational divide to ensure that the Red Ryder stayed in every closet in America. This period marked the rise of the character-building narrative to its most aggressive height. The company began to release literature suggesting that a boy without a BB gun was at risk of becoming weak or un-American. They linked the lever action of the Red Ryder to the very survival of the nation's spirit. But this focus on the abstract idea of manhood allowed the company to sidestep the mounting evidence of the product's physical dangers. The high-capacity gravity feed system was a marvel of convenience, but it was also inherently flawed. If the rifle was held at the wrong angle, or if the spring was worn, the velocity could fluctuate wildly. One shot might strike a paper target, while the next might carry enough force to shatter a window or worse. The company viewed these incidents as user error. Therefore, they felt no obligation to change the fundamental design. They were protected by a cultural shield of nostalgia that made the Red Ryder seem beyond reproach. While the sales numbers reached into the tens of millions, the secret history of the Red Ryder became a story of what was left out of the box. There were no meaningful safety manuals in the early days, and the warnings were often printed in tiny type that no child would ever read. The company was operating in a regulatory vacuum, a time before modern consumer protection agencies had the power to intervene. They were the kings of their own domain, and they used that power to ensure that the Red Ryder remained as potent and unregulated as possible. They understood that the lethality of the gun was part of its appeal. If it were too safe, it would lose the edge that made it a rite of passage. They were selling a controlled version of danger, but the control was an illusion. The Red Ryder was the crown jewel of the American toy box, but it was a crown built on the silence of the injured and the calculated indifference of the boardroom. The success was absolute, but the moral foundation was beginning to show the same fatigue as a well-used spring. As the 1970s and 80s approached, the cultural shield that had protected the Daisy manufacturing company began to crack under the weight of modern scrutiny. The world was no longer the unregulated frontier of the 1930s, and the government was starting to ask difficult questions about the ballistic capabilities of what was being sold as a childhood toy. Federal investigators and consumer safety advocates began to look closely at the lethality of the Red Ryder. They discovered that the rifle was capable of firing at velocities that far exceeded the requirements for simple target practice. Therefore, the company found itself in the crosshairs of a new era of accountability, but instead of adapting the product to meet higher safety standards, the leadership chose to dig in their heels. They believed that the Red Ryder was an American institution and that any attempt to regulate its power was an attack on the very concept of the American family. Internal documents from this period reveal a chilling reality behind the boardroom doors. The company was aware of a significant issue with ricochet, where the round lead balls would bounce off hard surfaces with enough force to cause permanent eye injuries. They knew that the smoothbore barrel of the Red Ryder, while cheap to manufacture, contributed to this unpredictability. However, the company fought tooth and nail against requirements for prominent warning labels on the wood stock. They feared that if the rifle looked too dangerous, parents would stop buying it. They were prioritizing the aesthetic of the cowboy carbine over the physical safety of the children using it. This was the dark heart of the corporate strategy: maintain the illusion of a harmless toy at all costs, even as the list of litigants and injured parties grew longer every year. The legal battles became a war of attrition. Daisy used its long history and its status as a pillar of the community to frame itself as a victim of overzealous regulators. They argued that the BB gun was a tool for teaching responsibility and that any injury was the result of a lack of supervision rather than a defect in the product. But the rhythm of the courtroom was beginning to change. Evidence surfaced showing that the company had resisted adding a simple manual safety mechanism for years because it would have added a few cents to the production cost of each unit. They were weighing the price of a child's safety against the profit margins of a $19 rifle. The jagged edge of their corporate logic was exposed. They wanted the prestige of a national icon, but they refused to accept the responsibility that came with it. The pressure from the Consumer Product Safety Commission eventually led to massive recalls and forced changes in how the guns were marketed. The company was forced to acknowledge that the Red Ryder was not just a toy, but a high-velocity air rifle that required adult supervision. This was a shattering blow to the frontier myth they had spent decades building. The era of the unregulated backyard was coming to an end, and the Red Ryder was the primary casualty. While the company survived these legal onslaughts through aggressive settlements and lobbying, the damage to its soul was permanent. They were no longer the benevolent providers of childhood dreams. They were a embattled manufacturer of a controversial weapon. The chrome and wood were still there, but the innocence was gone. The Red Ryder had become a symbol of a corporate culture that viewed the customer as a liability and the truth as something to be managed rather than told. The company was still moving units, but the shadow of the 1980s was long, and the future of the American BB gun was about to be redefined by the very scandals they tried so desperately to bury. In the modern era, the Red Ryder has settled into a strange and quiet existence as a ghost of the American past. The high-velocity scandals and the courtroom battles of the late 20th century eventually forced the brand to retreat into the safe harbor of nostalgia. Therefore, the company shifted its focus away from the aggressive manhood marketing of the previous decades and began to lean heavily into the cinematic legacy of the product. They realized that their greatest asset was no longer the power of the spring, but the memory of the childhoods they had helped define. But this transition into a heritage brand didn't erase the dark history of the design. It simply buried it under a layer of holiday tradition and sentimental storytelling. The product remains largely unchanged in its fundamental mechanics, a 19th century invention surviving in a 21st century world. The closure of the original Plymouth factory and the eventual move to Arkansas marked the end of an era for the people who had built the legend. The company, that had once been the beating heart of a Michigan town, became a global operation focused on cost efficiency and brand licensing. However, the true tragedy of the Red Ryder is found in the permanent warning that now accompanies every unit sold. The famous phrase about shooting one's eye out is no longer just a line from a movie. It is a legal necessity born from decades of documented injuries and corporate silence. The brand has been forced to accept a reality where its most iconic feature is also its most significant liability. They are selling a dream of the frontier to a generation that lives in a world of absolute safety, and the tension between those two realities is visible in every warning label and every orange-tipped barrel. As the years continue to pass, the Red Ryder exists as a paradox of American consumerism. It is a product that was built on the collapse of an agricultural empire, sustained by the psychological manipulation of children, and nearly destroyed by its own lethal potential. It remains the most recognizable BB gun in history, not because it is the best, but because it is the most persistent. The company survived by becoming a symbol of a time that never truly existed, a time when a weapon was just a toy and a child was just a cowboy in training. They have mastered the art of survival by commodifying the past, but the shadow of the 1988 safety hearings still looms over every decision they make. The story of the Red Ryder is a reminder that a product can become so ingrained in the national identity that it becomes immune to its own dark history. We choose to remember the wood and the leather, and we choose to forget the lawsuits and the internal memos. This brings us to a final, haunting reflection on the nature of the American icon. When we hand a Red Ryder to the next generation, are we giving them a piece of history? Or are we just passing on a dangerous myth that we aren't ready to let go of? The legend is still for sale, and the lever still clicks with the same satisfying sound of the frontier. But as the sun sets on the era of the mechanical toy, the question remains, is the memory worth the risk?